I retired from city management in early 2019, and so uh, I didn't have to go through the city management by Zoom conference or city council meetings by Zoom and all that. And so I'm very much a novice at Zoom. My apologies. Um, Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I apologize to those that were here last week for basically botching my arrival by on time. So I think I'm on in sync now. I uh, I guess Diane Kaelin Sukra is Anne is kind of the Canadian is kind of the connecting point between us. I started writing a post or e-newsletter for Substack that I called Democraticus, which according to my research, is the Latin word for democratist. And you may have heard that word. It's an old word. It just simply, democratist just simply means somebody who believes in and attempts to practice the principles and precepts of democracy. So, as Anne said in her email about me, I worked in city management from let's see, I would say the mid 70s, but then I've qualified as 20th century. It was 1975, 76, as I got out of graduate school at the now University of North Texas, and I went to work for the city of Richardson as an assistant to the city manager, and kind of went on from there. And over the next 43 years, I served in small communities. I was a city manager at the age of 25. Thought I knew everything, and soon learned I knew nothing, as much as I thought I did. And it was a little community in East Texas near Longview called Gilmer. That was an old county seat. I've lived in Texas since the mid 70s, but I had, before that, I lived in Richardson and Bryan, and they're a little larger cities, particularly Richardson, as you probably know, is a Dallas suburb. And here I was in this little town in East Texas. They viewed anybody from north of the Red River as a Yankee. Many of them were still fighting the war of northern aggression, the Civil War, and this is 1978 when I went there. The city was broke. If it had been a private business, we would have had to declare bankruptcy. And it went on from there, but it's very had a lot of low to moderate income residents, but a very segregated community. And being from the Midwest, I just, this was all new to me. I didn't realize that, and some of you from East Texas may disagree with me, but I found it to be a very caste-like society. And if you've read the book Caste, and you know kind of where I'm coming from on that. And then later I moved to Lockhart, Texas, which you probably are familiar with because it's not too far from San Antonio and famous for its barbecue. Whereas Gilmer had a fairly high, at the time, Black population. Today, Gilmer has a pretty high Hispanic population too, because of the poultry industry moving into Northeast Texas. But in Lockhart, Lockhart was about 52% Hispanic. It may be more than that now, I don't know. But it also had a lot of low to moderate income people. But I started noticing a common theme, and that is not most of the citizens that I dealt with didn't know anything about city government, really government in general, but more on that in a few minutes. And I would try to do my part to be invited out into, particularly, I like to target 8th grade and come out and do I'd teach a day of civics at the middle school. The middle school teacher loved me because they had the day off, basically. They could sit back in the back of the room and listen to me. And it kind of went on from there. I realized that the students were getting just a very, very little bit, if any, exposure to local government. And I started seeing really that, learning about government and civics, or whatever you prefer to call it, was viewed by most people as just, almost like punishment. Oh gosh, I got to take civics. And I started also noticing that I don't know if it's like this in a lot of places, but the schools I went into, the best teachers were not teaching civics. In fact, they were mostly coaches, and they were probably very good coaches, but they had to, fill their time with something else too. And so it just was viewed as what's the point of this? And I spent 16 years in College Station as assistant city manager and city manager. Now that was a college community, so there were more educated people, but still, there were a lot of people. I had people come up to me that were my friends, went to church with. They would say, "Hey, Tom, are you like elected? Are you like the mayor?" And I realized, boy, they don't know anything about the council manager form of government. So when I finally retired, after my last community, which is Westlake, which is the other end of the spectrum of the communities I just described to you, particularly the first two, Gilmer and Lockhart. Westlake is a Dallas suburb that's very small, but extremely wealthy. Pardon me. And I kind of made a promise to myself that when I retire, I was going to, maybe for the International City Manager Association's magazine, or for the Texas City Manager Association newsletter, I was going to write some things about civic education and basically civic illiteracy. Because I found that, I might be talking to somebody that had a college degree or a couple college degrees, but they still, were not informed or educated about city government. What I found as I started researching for some of these they were just going to be essays. I've realized, well, there's some really good organizations out there that have been focused on this a long time. And you all probably know this from your work, but democracy is one form of government that the citizens have to have a certain base knowledge so they can function effectively and provide an informed consent of the governed. In other words, we the people, as our Constitution begins with. So I started realizing, holy cow, this is really pervasive. And there's in my book, I use a lot of materials. It was my pandemic project, and pretty soon I realized I need to write something broader than just about lack of knowledge about city government. It's across the board. So that's how I tackled it. Where I'm coming from, I think, is that democracy cannot function without an informed citizenry, informed in the sense of understanding the basics of their form of government at the local level, state, county, local, including city and county and school board and state government and the federal government. And that level of knowledge does not exist. There's, the surveys that are done every year or every other year that show our level of civic knowledge has been declining. And, one of my quotes in the book, I steal from, I'm sorry, I lost it. Sandra Day O'Connor, the Supreme Court Justice. She said that most Americans can give you the names of the three stooges, Larry, Curly, and Moe, but they can't tell you the names of the three branches of the federal government. And surveys have revealed that. And part and parcel to his lack of civic knowledge is it's very closely connected. It's interwoven, is historical illiteracy. They've done a lot of research and surveys about, how much do Americans know about their own government's history and, Revolutionary War or pre-Revolutionary War on up to the present. And it's abysmal. It's really bad. And, I like to use the analogy in my book that, you really wouldn't want to get on a plane, I don't think, if you didn't think that your pilot had knowledge about how to fly. Or would you want to, have surgery by a surgeon who is not educated in the operation he's about to or she's about to perform? I think the answer is a resounding no. But democracy is one of those things that, unless Americans are concerned enough to make sure that we are informed, in my opinion, and I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but a lot of what we see going on today are by people that are very angry or very frustrated or very distrustful, and several other things like that. But I think part of it is they don't really understand how their government is supposed to work. And so it makes them very, very susceptible to what I call the siren song of non-democracy, specifically authoritarianism. Things, we use fancy terms for them like the unified executive or something like that. Basically, it's just a ruler, and we start to think that that's democracy, and it's not. So it's hard to fight for something that you don't know anything about, democracy. And I don't hold myself up to be any more knowledgeable than anybody else about democracy, but I think I know something. But you'd be surprised at what you encounter. And yes, it can happen with people that have low education levels, but it happens a lot with people that have college degrees, and it's not viewed as very important. While our founding fathers, in fact, I quoted one in the book. It's have you ever heard the name Benjamin Rush? Benjamin Rush. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a college professor. He was a doctor, and he was from near Philadelphia. But he used the term that because he, along with several others of our founding fathers, as we call them, recognized the need for democratic education, small d democratic, in civic education, as we call it today. And he used the term that we need to use our schools as to create, he called them Republican machines. Now, that's Republican with a small r, as in members of a republic. And they understood that the school system was just vital to maintaining democracy. And so you have people like the Webster of Webster's Dictionary. They really concentrated on public education, and it's been a mainstay of our democracy. But I ran across a gentleman who's a distinguished professor at the University of Virginia's Education College, and Edwin Hirsch, I believe is his name. And in his book, he documents how civic education in this country has declined. And he attributes it to beginning in the late 40s with those of you that have a teaching background, which I do. I actually got certified to teach in Illinois, where I got my bachelor's degree. But he attributes it to how we changed our means of teaching. He said up until the late 40s, early 50s, he called it the common school, that most schools across the country, public schools anyway, were teaching pretty much the same thing. And he really, really emphasized how important the teachers were. And in fact, he makes the case that teachers in this country, from our inception to that time period in the late 40s, early 50s, were very responsible for making sure that civic education was delivered in the schools and delivered in a meaningful way in terms of learning. So when guys like, he mentions Thomas Dewey, which of course you guys, if you're like me, you think about Thomas Dewey and the Dewey Decimal System, but Dewey was an educator, and he, along with several other educators that were teaching future teachers in our colleges and universities, were basically changing their premises on how they felt like children learned. And they introduced what's called the constructivist method of education. And I was superintendent of a city-owned charter school in Westlake for 11 years. So I've heard about constructivism all the time. And basically the teachers and principals I was around viewed constructivism in education as a way that you let the child kind of just decide what they want to learn about, what they're interested in. And Hirsch advocates that this is all wrong. How can a child know exactly what they want to learn about when effectively when they start out in education that they don't know they don't know a lot. So he attributes it, and he gives a lot of documented evidence about why things why our civic knowledge declined, and it had to do a lot with how subjects were delivered in school by teachers based upon how they were trained in the university, excuse me, colleges of education. So fast forward to today, I took on the, I just started writing this, as I said, it was going to be an series of essays, and I realized, no, it's broader than that. So I'm not here to sell books. I'm not, but it morphed into my pandemic project. And I tried to be as serious about it as I knew how to be. And I'm not holding myself up as any better scholar than anyone else that wants to tackle subjects. But I think I have a lot of documentation of the book, and that shows that not only are we not teaching civic education very well, but when I started, it was in 2020 to today. There's a lot of topics that we're not covering the way they should be covered. Like the unfettered right to vote as citizens. And, as you know, that's one of our, I say, as you know, I believe most people, a lot of people see now that voting has been basically, in my view, attacked and limited, and a lot of things that are going on. But, critical thinking is something that is a key part of civic education. In my view, it's not being taught very well. And while Americans have a long history of gravitating towards conspiracy theories, it's rampant today. It's probably been fueled more than anything by social media. So the question becomes, there's a lot of things, in my opinion, obviously no charge for all these free opinions, that we need to address in this country to improve civic education. And there's also many other issues too. As I worked on these books in my Substack column, I realized that there's a lot of reform that we need in our democracy, and yet we're so busy fussing and fighting with each other. If you bring up something like that, you're immediately viewed as being partisan. I come from a long line myself, just so you know, of, as I mentioned to Ann last time I was late, is that they were Midwest. I was from a long line of Midwestern Republicans. And, even though I lived outside of Chicago, lived in Cincinnati, my family's lineage they were farmers, that came here from Switzerland and from Ireland, and they were very conservative. And so, just like in Texas, where they teach Texas history, in my opinion, almost ad nauseum, in Illinois, they teach, and I think, Ann, you're from Illinois, that you learn all about Illinois history, and Abe Lincoln. I grew up being very proud of my Illinois roots, so to speak, and Illinois, land of Lincoln and the Republican Party. But I think Abe Lincoln would be rolling over in his grave today. So, speaking euphemistically, what's happened to that party? And yet I viewed myself as a conservative. I don't always necessarily think government is the answer for everything, but I don't think what's going on in this country today is conservatism. I think it's, in my opinion, it's fascism. And my father, he didn't see combat, but he signed up to go fly in the Army Air Corps and fly over Germany in B-17 bombers. And I think he'd be appalled today if he could see what has happened with the Republican Party. And I attribute a lot of that to people supporting that viewpoint because they don't have proper democratic education. And so it's not a problem that can be fixed right away. And then there's other things, as I mentioned, that need to be, in my opinion, addressed, especially democratic reform. But I think until we somehow get serious about understanding how critical it is that our children come out of school with a balanced view of democracy, not that it's perfect. What is that Churchill quote about, uh, I can't remember how he said it, but he's basically saying that, he's looked at all the forms of government, and he's basically saying democracy isn't perfect, but it's still the best one in his view. And yes,
Tom, I have a question for you, but I'm going to take a little pause first. It's 8:29, and we try to get the meat of everything right between 8 and 8:30, because we've got some leaders here that need to get on with their lives. So I'm going to take a quick pause, and then I have a question. So for those who do need to move on for their day, thank you for being with us, and thank you, Tom, for sharing what you've learned across the years. We're going to next week start taking a look at immigration and what is happening as we discover it together, but immigration locally, and what people are working on and collaborative efforts. So just so you know, that's what's around the corner. So Tom, my question is, so you make a great case. I'm right there with you. And yes, I grew up in Illinois. What you were describing was pretty much my upbringing as well. But my question is that, so you served all these 40 plus years in various places. What kind of action did you take during that time to maybe even help leaders, civic leaders, staff around you, community leaders, in terms of raising their education around how this all works? Because it's not just our children. I mean, that's where we gotta like start. But what kind of experiences did you have with that?
well, early on in my career, we didn't do anything. And I'm not saying that with any amount of pride, it's just the truth. We had city council orientations, but I mean, that's like 2 hours and then you're done. But in College Station, we realized that our citizens lacked a lot of knowledge, and we started Citizens University, which a lot of cities have some form of that now. We modeled ours after another university community, Fort Collins, Colorado, and it was very good. It was like 12 modules on different subjects, but it was very, to use my words, it's very nuts and bolts oriented. And we'd have a section, a lesson, excuse me, a module on public works, for example, or a module on public safety, and we'd have the police chief come in and teach, and the fire chief teach the public safety module, or public works director on the public works one. And it helped a lot. And we were trying to develop people for our boards and commissions, and also to run for council. And eventually it became a kind of a credential that people that were interested in running for elective office, specifically city council, would put in their campaign flyers that they attended the College Station Citizens University. When I look back on it, I think it was good. If I was asked by Diane Kaylin Sukra what I would do differently now based on what I know and entered in, put into that book I mentioned, I think I would try to think through, okay, it's good for citizens to understand how the streets are managed and the streets are repaired, and that there's a system for doing that. It's not just willy-nilly, and public safety. But each one of those modules, I would focus on connecting them back to democratic education. For example, the public safety module, I would spend some time after talking about what the police department does and how they do it and how they're organized and all that. Spend some time talking about, well, how are we doing with the rule of law? How are we doing with law enforcement? How are we, and then a broader question, how are we doing for all those modules would be, how are we dealing with equity of service? Which I can tell you, when I first got in city management, equity of service, especially in places like Gilmer, they'd look at you like you had, 5 ears or 4 eyes or something like that. It was just a foreign concept because, well, it was not institutionalized. It was like we started delivering service, and for example, in the minority parts of Gilmer, which were mostly Black, and doing things that had never been done over there in terms of just basic health and sanitation things. And yet, what's the concept that underpins that is equity of service, and not preferential treatment just based upon who you are, how much money you have, or your color of your skin. So I hope that answers your question. And I think that those kinds of programs have great potential, but I think ours, looking back, and I've been away from College Station now since 2005, so they may have changed. I'm sure they've changed it and updated it, but we didn't really try to connect what we were teaching about, somewhat technical topics, whether it's how city finances are organized, or we had a financial module. We had, for example, we had a module the city secretary taught about. Well, it's basically about how they run elections. So that would have been a great place to introduce the idea of unfettered access to voting. Do we have it? Do we not? What are our problems with that? And so that would be kind of my answer to your question.
Yeah, it's a good answer. In fact, it's also kind of sparked some conversation in chat. There is a comment. Tom, you've seen leaders of many towns making decisions about work and volunteer service after they retire from city jobs. Our current mayor, Ron Nirenberg, would likely have been appointed to a federal national position if the Democrats had won the presidency. He had taken San Antonio successfully through the pandemic and the introduction of compassionate city ethics. What are some options? Well, I didn't read this, but this is a really good question. What are some options, Tom, that you see are terming out mayor that he could pursue to continue the great work he's been doing in terms of very similar to what you're talking about?
With volunteers, you mean developing
No,
volunteers?
he's talking, I think his question, and Paul can correct me, is specifically about our mayor. Our current mayor, he terms out in May. And so, dear Paul is, I think, trying to help our mayor find a new job. What could he do, with these skills? Is that your question, Paul? Or do you want to define it more?
No, that's exactly it.
Well, and I apologize if I'm not trying to evade an answer. So if I don't get the answer, it means I didn't understand the question well. I would think, and some of these I would think he'd be aware of, but I would think he could find a role with an organization like the National League of Cities, or the Texas Municipal League, to plug in, and depending on what he wants to develop through those organizations. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I would hope he might be interested in democratic education. And I think that one of the things, if I could go back to critiquing my own profession, we tended to view civic education as something, well, that's the school's job. Well, it's really not. It's everybody's job. And I'm still fighting that today. I run across city manager colleagues of mine, friends of mine, who look at me like, why are you caring? You're not a teacher, Tom. You're not an educator. Well, I sort of was, but I don't argue that point with them. But back to your mayor who's leaving office in the spring, I would think through some of those civic what I call city organizations, that he could plug in there. But also, I've noticed I don't know, do many of you get on Substack, the internet-based platform? There's some great writers on there, but many of them there's organizations coming forward now, like Democracy Forward. He might be able to plug in there. They might have a place for him there. There's lots of, I would definitely check into that. If I had my book where I could look at it, I think on my footnotes, I have several organizations that I've used their stuff that he might plug into, that, if he offered his services. It's because it all starts at the local level, in my opinion. And
he talks the same way, local.
Yeah. I mean, if we don't do things well at the local level, it's not going to filter up, to state or federal. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think it does. Tom, last week we did have a short conversation, and you did mention a couple names to check out on Substack besides yourself. Do you remember a couple names that people might look for on Substack?
yeah, I didn't know anything about Substack, but I started. My wife, who reads a lot, started following several people, and one of the ones I highly recommend is Heather Cox Richardson. She is a historian. I think currently she's on faculty at Boston College, I think. But her area of specialization is Civil War and Reconstruction, but she knows a lot about American history. But she does a great job. She started writing this Substack post, they call them, called Letters from an American. And and all these things on Substack, they have free and paid subscriptions. Like mine is just free. And I would encourage you all to make me feel better to subscribe. But anyway, but Heather Cox Richardson, you can sign up for her free one. You get a little more stuff if you sign up for the paid. But she publishes almost every day. And she shows what's going on, like what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now with the change in administrations. And she'll do something about how that ties back to the oligarchy that existed in this country in the 1850s before the Civil War. And she'll show, she makes those kind of connections. She's very, very good. And she does what she calls brings receipts. At the end of her newsletter, she has all the links of a lot of her sources. Another one is, what's his name? Steve Schmidt. He's a former Republican. He resigned from the Republican Party about, I don't know, back in 2015, I think. He's a former campaign advisor to, former Republican presidents like George Bush and a lot of other campaigns. But he is and you have to know he's very critical of the Republican Party today. His newsletter is called The Warning. And it's the kind of thing you really need to read. It's not going to cheer you up, but it's sobering. There's several others. I'm looking. There's a Substack app that is free. You can download and read it. There's another one I just signed up for. It's called the Midas, like King Midas Touch Network, and it's becoming big. I think one of the things that we all need to be cognizant of, and maybe you are, I'm sorry, I am, is that our news media is going through fundamental, if not revolutionary change, in my opinion. And what we call the corporate media, some call them the legacy networks, are not performing their role. The fourth estate is the news media, and several of them have just taken a powder on the whole thing, and they're not asking the hard questions. They're not being critical when they need to be in terms of being the watchdog in a democracy. So they're all just taking a pass. And part of this because several of them are owned by billionaires who want to ingratiate themselves with the current president. So Midas Touch is also on the Midas Touch Network is on Substack. They publish almost a daily newsletter, and they're very good, very good. Another guy I would highly recommend is Stephen Beschloss, Beschloss. Or in German you say Beschloss. But and there's others you may know from MSNBC, but a lot of these are people that basically felt like they were pushed out of mainstream media because they were being critical of a lot of the current activities of the Republican Party, and so they just went to Substack and they started writing, and it's a great place to get, I think, much more accurate picture of what's going on. I'm
Tom,
just,
we have a hand up, and I think we have time for one more question before 8:45. Kendra?
Hi, Paul. I just wanted to say I'm also from the Midwest, Iowa, Illinois border, and I was raised by Republican farmers. I love my life in Texas, but what you just touched on about the media, and just with the youth organizing, person that I had on my panel last week, just thinking about this stuff, like these four billionaires that were at the inauguration, and I'm not stating any political point of view, I want to make that clear to everybody right now, literally control 90% of the media that your children are watching, our youth are watching. They have a plan to promote their messages and their products to our children 24 hours a day. And I would just like to point out, taking TikTok off the ballot was not for our safety. It was like, just like communist China does to their people. It's filtering in a free press what our children can see and what they want them to know. So it is so important now more than ever to teach children and the community what government is, what we should expect for government, put in strategic prevention frameworks to ensure government, like with Strong Cities Network. It's just to have these leaders come back and have these meetings, because Southwest voters registration was part of that as well. Like David had mentioned in the comments. I'm sorry, I'm driving too, so it's a little hard for me to put all my thoughts together. But just thank you for what you do, and this part of education with our youth classes, I think is something I'm going to push to my coordinators and administration as well, because we really need to understand what government is. And that's all I have. I know I took a lot of time, but thank you so much, sir. I'd like to maybe connect with you at a later time about talking to my group of organizers about teaching some civic engagement.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ann has my
That's
contact information, and Ann, if I could real quickly, since you're a faith liaison, I just sent out my last 2 days ago, I think it was my last Democraticus, I call it, or Democratist, is titled Saved from What, for What? And I go into a little bit of my history as a member of a very conservative Bible-based church in College Station, where I learned how to do inductive Bible study. And I was reacting to the president's comment in his inaugural address, where he said he was saved by God to make America great again. And I explore the whole idea of saved from what, for what? And, it's, and also I tried to bootstrap it to Bishop Booty's
comment, yeah.
sermon at the inaugural prayer service, which I thought was very, very on point. So, but anyway.
Strong leaders there. So I want to thank everybody for coming this morning, and really thank you, Tom.
And any way I can help you, let me know.
Okay.